What is going on? I want to welcome you from Half Court for today, Tuesday, November 28th, 2023, the day that we will all remember as perhaps the rock bottom of this current rebuild of the Detroit Pistons. I am Sean Murphy, and we have to talk about that game that happened last night against the Washington Wizards at home. I was there in attendance to cover the game, and it was a rough one. Detroit loses to the second worst team in the league, the Washington Wizards, who was coming into the game on a 9-game skid of their own. Ultimately, Kyle Kuzma was too much for Detroit to handle. He had 32 points. He had 11 boards. He had 8 assists. He almost had a triple-double coming back to his hometown. It always seems like something whenever, whenever Kyle Kuzma comes back to his home area, it always seems like he really puts up and in particular suits up for that game. So not really particularly a surprise that he played as well as he did. I think the biggest surprise and perhaps the biggest disappointment, not only just, for everyone involved, but, for Coach Monty Williams, for the fans, for people tuning in, was the fact that it was as convincing as it was, especially to a team that was coming in and struggling with a lot of the things that you have been struggling with. And you also have to put it into context where these teams are at in their respective situations, right? I mean, Detroit is in year 4 of their rebuild. They have guys like Cade Cunningham, Asar Thompson, Jaden Ivey, Jalen Duren, Isaiah Stewart. Like they have their building blocks, so to speak. And, according to Tom Gores, going into this season, we're not rebuilding anymore. We're building. We're supposed to be taking what we have and taking that next step. And Washington, on the other hand, just traded Bradley Beal in the offseason, acquired Jordan Poole in a clear effort to try and lose games, see exactly what they might have in-house. But their best players are Kyle Kuzma and Jordan Poole. They are not trying to win basketball games. In fact, they are trying to position themselves to do what the Pistons needed to do a few years ago themselves, because the Wizards, are in a very similar situation to when the Pistons started their rebuild. And that's kind of the crux of the issue of this loss, is it was in the fashion that it happened. And in particular, it was to the team that it happened against. And, Monty was, did not mince words in his post-game presser. It was very short. It was very brief. And it was because the message was sent. There was nothing else to say. He said, quote, "It's just a level of growing up on this team. Understanding what game plan discipline is. All the stuff is what we talk about all the time. Enough talking. That wasn't fight on the floor. That wasn't Pistons basketball by any stretch of the imagination. We have to have people that honor the organization and the jersey by competing at a high level every night. Not talking about execution, just competing. That wasn't it, and that's on me." And I think that if you had to sum up the biggest issue that the Pistons have right now is you can control, you can't control necessarily who's going to be available on the court for you each and every single night. You can't even necessarily control how much of your shots are going to fall, in the bottom of the net. That's something that could be very frustrating, especially for a young team that's struggling with spacing. But the thing that you can control is your effort level, is your level of attention to detail, is the overall reaction that you have to losing. Because at a certain point, especially when you're a professional athlete, when you're in the NBA, which is the top basketball league in the world, at a certain point, losing has to bother you. It has to get to you, to your core. Because when you lose 14 games in a row for the second time in 3 years, which they did, back in 2021-22, this is, now tied for their second longest losing streak in the history of the franchise. And this is their second 11-game losing streak in the calendar year. They've won 4 games since the trade deadline. Like, when all of those things happen, James Edwards III said it really well. When you let losing into your door, it's hard to get it out. And that's ultimately the risk and the gamble that you take when you go into the rebuild. And it's not even like Detroit hasn't acquired talent. They've acquired a lot of talent. But I think the biggest gap that the franchise is in right now, and the biggest criticism you can make of Troy Weaver's tenure thus far, is they've gotten a collection of talent, but it's time to turn that collection of talent into a roster, and specifically a roster that fits that identity of the Detroit Pistons. Because, the biggest thing that this team is focused on is, if we're not going to be that team, that can go out and score offensively every night, we have to be that team on the defensive side of the ball. But they haven't been that team. They haven't been that team that's really been able to do either thus far. And when this team did have that swagger and that physicality and that competitive edge to them to start the season, when they believed going into each and every single game that they could win, they had those moments where they looked like they were ready to turn the corner. They have pieces where you can say, all right, there are things to build around, which was not something you could say at the beginning of this rebuild. But now, how do you get players that have won before? Guys that do have experience, guys that do fill those gaps, guys that do complement the needs that this roster has going forward. Because we can talk about acquiring young talent, and the draft is still going to be something that's absolutely essential, even when this team, in theory, is back to its winning ways, back to contending on a year-to-year basis, because you have to build the overall foundation of your team through the draft, especially when you're a small market team. I mean, we're seeing teams like the Denver Nuggets. The reason why they're still as successful as they are, obviously they have Jokic, obviously they have Murray, they have Aaron Gordon, they have all sorts of guys up to down their roster that are extremely talented. But also it's because they get guys like Christian Brown that can help and complement the edges. It's the fact that they have rookies and young players that can come in during the regular season, contribute in a significant manner, and even if they're not necessarily going to play heavy minutes in the finals or in the playoffs, they still get you there because they play winning basketball along the way. And so that's always going to have to be something. But the people that are saying that, this is the time to fire Troy Weaver, I disagree with that. Now, don't get me wrong. At this point, you cannot say that his seat is cold, or that, there isn't going to be heavier skepticism on the front office of the Pistons or what they do going forward, because this is clearly the job. This is clearly what has to happen going forward, is the roster around those young pieces needs to improve. And in order to do that, you might have to trade some young pieces that you really like, some young pieces that you really think, fit what you're trying to build. And so when looking at the players that, are untouchable or untradeable, or what are the guys that are going to stay versus the guys that are going to go, that's a whole entirely other conversation. And I think that's going to make itself pretty clear as time goes on. I think as of right now, in my personal opinion, it's pretty apparent that Detroit has three players that are, quite untouchable. To me, that's Cade Cunningham. I know there's been some discourse about the quickest way to for the Pistons to get back to where they need to be is trade Cade Cunningham. Absolutely not. When you get at the top of the lottery, let alone win it for the first time in 50 years, and you have a player that's shown as much upside as Cade has, especially when he has shooting around him and has some proper pieces, and when he can actually get into a rhythm and some consistent basketball under him, I think it's pretty clear that that's a guy that you do not want to trade, because you do not know when you can get a guy back like that back in your building again. Now, I do think that they need to go get someone that can help and alleviate some of that pressure of handling the ball, of being a playmaker, someone that can run the offense. I think with Cade, it's been pretty clear that the turnovers have been something that have become a little bit of an issue. And at the very least, at the beginning stages of his career, as he's learning more of the NBA game, very similar to what Devin Booker had, he needs his Chris Paul. He needs that guy next to him, that veteran that can help and guide him through these early steps of his career. And, Monty talked about how, Devin Booker Chris Paul just talked about how Devin Booker just downloaded his brain when he was there in Phoenix, how he just absorbed all the information that he possibly could, just asked him a ton of questions, just got into his ear as much as he possibly could. Cade needs that, and he needs that badly, because right now you have a team that is full of guys who are 24 and younger, and all of their veteran guys who you brought in to try and help take this team going forward, even though there are some talented pieces there. Monte Morris is a guy that we all know would help this team right now. Bojan Bogdanovic, who could be returning again within the next week or two, is a guy that we all know could help this team right now. But they can only help you so much when they're in street clothes on the sidelines. And as great as Bojan was, especially towards the first half of last season, when he was shooting at the level that he was, when he was playmaking and scoring and doing all the things that he was on the court to the level that he was, ever since, he hasn't been in the lineup. And yes, some of that you can definitely point to the fact that, let's be real, to end the season last year, the Pistons were positioning themselves in the draft to try and get the best lottery odds possible, which I know people look at and it's like, well, how did that work out? How did that work out for you? Well, the silver lining of it is Detroit couldn't have fallen past 5. And if you look at this past draft class, it is imperative that the Pistons did not fall past 5. Because as much as we like, even liked guys like Taylor Hendricks and Jarris Walker and all these different prospects that we talked about through this draft, there is a very clear delineation and gap between Asar Thompson and everyone else who was drafted after him. Especially you can even look at Taylor Hendricks, who was played as recently as a week ago, was playing action against the Motor City Cruise for the Fort Wayne Mad Ants in G League action. Already, I'm surprised, especially a Pacers team that is struggling as mightily on the defensive side as they are. The fact that Jarris Walker can't even get minutes in that rotation, that is a whole other conversation. That is not the topic of this video. That is not to bash another rookie, because every rookie has a different path. But the importance to show you is that that's how imperative it was that the Pistons didn't fall past 5 to get a guy who could still come in and play at the level that he has right now. Because can you imagine what this team would look like if they didn't have Asar Thompson right now? Because in my opinion, that's one of the building blocks. Him, Cade, and Jalen Duren, in my opinion, are the 3 untouchable players. Jaden Ivey, if you want to go and get that key veteran piece that can help and really take this team to the next level, I still think that the Pistons are better in the future with Jaden Ivey in it. However, I would not be, I would be ignorant to not acknowledge the fact that he is a piece that you could use to go and get a significantly impactful player right now. Having said that, though, the biggest thing that the Pistons need to make sure that they do, especially if they are going to go and make a move, and especially going and making a move out of a season of trial and a season almost not necessarily of panic, but of urgency, is to not put themselves behind the 8 ball like they did in the past. Don't make the Blake Griffin trade. Don't go get the Zach LaVines, who is a guy that could come in and help score the basketball and do a lot of things, offensively that would help this team right away, but also at the same time, possibly financially cripple this team with a player who's dealt with injury issues, who's heading into the twilight of his career, who won't be able to actually get you to a significant, substantial place as a franchise. And that is what makes this next couple of months so crucial, but so difficult for the Pistons, and is why the situation that they've put themselves in is as difficult as it is. I still think they have a lot of the right people in order to get themselves out of it. I think Monty Williams and the fire and the passion that he showed in that post game after, anyone that, has questions about whether or not he's committed to Detroit basketball and being, in this organization, I think those can be put to rest by hearing his overall feelings on the situation and where he's at. I think you look at, the overall organization, and listen, I know there's a lot of flack being given towards guys like Arn Tellem and his son right now. And listen, breaking news, nepotism in some level exists all over the world. We now go live with the breaking details. But with Arn Tellem, his job is really not on the basketball side of things. He might help with advising the big picture of the organization, but his job is really league-wide initiatives and being a relationship piece for the team. He does a lot of business-related deals. If we're looking at people to blame, I understand wanting to find those people and to point fingers at any different direction that you possibly can. But ultimately, especially when these problems go as far as they have, they do start at the top. And listen, I don't think that this is a point where, we have to put people's feet under the fire. But in the same light, we have to acknowledge where this team's been. And ultimately, change does need to be made to this roster in order for this team to take the next step. And ultimately, I think whatever moves those will be are going to be what decides the tenure of Troy Weaver. Because we've seen that he can get the talent. We've seen that he has an eye for scouting and has an ability to bring in players of character. But can he bring in a roster that complements those pieces? Can he help them turn that corner and take the next step? And can he fulfill the vision of building that program that is ultimately in the vision of the Detroit Pistons? That is going to be the telling tale. That is going to be the ultimate sign I would love to know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below. Obviously, I know this isn't the season that any fan has wanted. You know, obviously, I try to cover the team from as objective of a standpoint as humanly possible. However, the fandom is always going to be a part of me. That is something that just cannot escape. And obviously, the fan side of me is bummed. However, you know, ultimately, all that we can do is focus on the focus on the constructive, focus on what's next, and just remember, just be good to people, because ultimately, the people that run social media accounts of the Pistons, the people that work in public relations and communications, they are there to do their jobs and have nothing to do with the overall on-court product. So the biggest thing I would just remind people, especially in this season of trials and going through all these losses, is just be good to each other, because ultimately that's the only way that we get through these things is together. And that's what sports is about, is to bring people together. So I just want to remind people of that. But with that, be sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel for more Pistons and NBA coverage as a whole. We're going to be expanding our coverage to a lot of different things here throughout the season. We have a lot of different interests about basketball as a whole. But with that, this is Sean Murphy. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll catch you guys next time from Half Court. Be sure you're subscribed.